I'm Dr. Jessica Elliott. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of the West of England. My research in particular focuses on irregular migration, but more specifically than that, the issue of human trafficking. My PhD focused on the role of consent in the human trafficking of adult women for the purposes of sexual exploitation. Now, this involved untangling the complex legal issue of consent and looking at this spectrum of consent and coercion. Now, trafficking is defined by several important instruments at international level, EU level, including the United Nations Protocol to Prevent, Suppress and Punish Trafficking in Human Beings, the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking, and more recently, a European Union Directive of 2011, which will be transposed into UK law by April 2013. Now, trafficking is defined as a non-consensual process. There are three essential elements: transportation, harbouring, receipt, etc. of an individual through means of coercion or force or threats for the purpose of exploitation. Now, if we're talking about adult victims, the means of coercion, force or threats have to be present. So what we have here is the same issue that we'd have in other areas of law where consent or lack of consent is an issue. For example, in situations concerning allegations of rape, it's very difficult to determine lack of consent. Now, if there are not ostensible signs of coercion, things you may expect to see such as bruising or the use of force against a potential victim, it can be difficult to identify a trafficked victim as a trafficked victim, and therefore they may be deemed not trafficked. Now, the consequences of this can be quite severe. Ultimately, under the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, Article 10, there is an obligation upon states to have a process in place whereby victims are identified. So we need authorities who can have first contact with victims and refer them on to competent authorities in order to determine whether there are reasonable grounds to consider a victim has been trafficked. Following this, we'll have a conclusive grounds decision as to whether or not a victim has been trafficked. And now the outcome of somebody being determined a trafficked victim is that they then have access to a bespoke system of rights and assistance. If they're determined to be not trafficked, then they may be seen as, for want of a better expression, just another smuggled migrant, and therefore subject to perhaps criminal sanction, for example, for immigration offences such as possession of false documents. Now, the PhD, looking at this issue of consent, really has led me to looking further into this issue of victim identification. And my current research involves a project whereby I'm interviewing participants who come from various bodies who come into contact with trafficked victims. So we're looking at law enforcement, non-governmental organisations, charities, the UK Human Trafficking Centre, for example, and hopefully beyond. Now, this is the research is embryonic at present, but it's bringing some very interesting findings out. Now, what this research really focuses on is what the barriers are to identifying victims. Why are they not being identified as trafficked at a sufficiently early stage? We have a series of cases, the case of O, the case of N and LE, the case of LM, for example, whereby victims are not necessarily being seen at an early stage as victims at first instance and are being criminalised as a result of offences that they have committed in the course of being trafficked, i.e. offences that they have committed through compulsion as a result of having been trafficked. Now, on appeal, these cases are leading to different decisions because it's being recognised that these are trafficked victims, and therefore they should not necessarily be criminalised as a result of offences committed in the course of the trafficking, for example, possession of false documents, etc., or forced labour in a cannabis factory. So it's really essential that the victims are identified at an early stage and correctly identified as trafficked, so they have access to the bespoke rights regime that is available to them at present.